The Monster Guys podcast begins now.
Welcome to the Monster Guys podcast. My name is DC McGannon. As always, I'm with my partner and co-conspirator in all things creative, C. Michael McGannon. How you doing, Michael?
Pretty darn good. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening to you. Michael, I swear earlier you said to me that the Faeries got to you last night.
That's not what I said at all. I said my eyes were tired.
I don't know how Faeries got to me, came out of my eyes are tired.
I'm still trying to figure that one out myself. Now, they did get to me, mind you. They, one ran up and bit me on my toe while I was trying to go to sleep, but that's not what happened.
That's a little concerning, but we're going to get to that later because our show tonight is about fairies.
Conveniently enough, yes.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the fairy folk, but first, we have a little something we call Tales of the Unknown.
And now it's time for Tales of the Unknown.
So in today's episode of Tales of the Unknown, we're going to talk about the shark bite. There was a news article last week that was popping around about this shark that had a big chunk taken out of its side. You remember that article?
I do. I remember it because just a week before that, we saw one about a shark that was just taken to the depths of the ocean within a frighteningly short amount of time.
Now, a lot of people may not pay much attention to this, but I do. I mean, for one, I can't stand to be in water that I cannot see my feet in.
Because of sharks, right?
Because of sharks. I've had a couple of experiences myself, but whether it's an ocean or a lake, I don't go in waters that I can't see my feet in.
As a paranoid person, I don't blame you.
Listen, I mean, it just too close for comfort for me a couple times, but this shark, this great white, that had a chunk taken out of its side, it's fascinating me. What do you think was big enough or powerful enough or mean enough to take a bite out of a great white?
Oh, that's obvious. I think it's just Cthulhu rooting around for a midnight snack.
Cthulhu, oh my gosh. Everybody is on the Cthulhu bandwagon right now. I think Cthulhu is getting a little bit watered down, and we're probably going to piss him off at some point.
Watered down, ladies and gentlemen.
Watered down. That was an unintentional pun, but we'll go with it. I think we're going to piss him off at some point, and he's going to show up, and not many people are going to be very happy with what Cthulhu really is.
Right.
And I think there was actually, was it Alan Moore that recently talked about how he was going to go back to that origin story or the mysterious and dark story of Cthulhu.
It's kind of the same thing you said. He believes that we've gotten too comfortable with the idea of Cthulhu and Lovecraftian mythos, so he's going to bring back the terror. And I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I am too. I think we take these things too lightly. We have too many plushy Cthulhu toys and Cthulhu on socks and beanie caps and on kids' cups and plates.
Probably.
Yeah, so...
But what do you think took a bite out of the shark? I mean...
Well, honestly, if I'm going to say something, I'm going to go with something like Leviathan.
That would be kind of cool and very terrifying. Yes.
I mean, absolutely terrifying. But, there's so much in the ocean that we don't know about.
Yeah.
There's just so many things that could have taken the bite out of that shark. You were talking during our conversation about it could have been cannibalism.
Yeah, well, that's what the scientists say. Or it could have been, like the gargantuan squid down at the deep, deep, dark depths of the ocean.
I don't think we have an idea. That shark that was taken down to the depths, that was being tracked, it never showed back up again. Was it Cthulhu? Was it Leviathan? Was it something we have no idea actually exists at this point?
Probably the space worm from Star Wars.
Space worm from Star Wars. Who knows, ladies and gentlemen, but it's strange, and it's happening in our universe, and I think when it comes time for some summertime, you better be careful what waters you're swimming in.
Boom.
Okay, let's get into our topic of the evening, fairies.
Yay, fairies!
Yeah, it's a fascinating subject and one that reaches pretty wide.
Yeah, it is, and I don't think many people realize just how wide it does reach, because I think we get into the mindset that a fairy is Tinkerbell.
Right, and I've mentioned this before, that so many people have the idea about fairies that it's Tinkerbell, this small little creature with blonde hair and a green little tunic of some form that is flying around, sprinkling pixie dust on people, and that's not an accurate picture entirely of fairies.
It's not accurate, and it's very narrow-minded, unfortunately.
And I mean, technically, Tinkerbell isn't really a fairy.
Not really. I mean, she kind of fits into the group, but she's more of an English pixie.
She's
creature.
a pixie.
Yeah.
That's why she spreads pixie dust.
Exactly, yes.
But, you know, regardless of how you categorize her, to lump all fairies into the character of
Tinkerbell, yeah.
Tinkerbell, I don't think is fair or accurate. So I'm going to give an extreme opposite view of fairies with one of my favorite, and I think one of your favorite of the fairy kind, and that's the Dullahan.
That is one of my absolute favorites of all monsters, hands down.
And for the record, the Dullahan is the headless horseman of Ireland.
Yes, he is, and he's very different from the stereotypical headless horseman of Ichabod Crane's story as well.
Right, we're not necessarily talking Sleepy Hollow, we're talking about a brutal and terrifying monster in the Dullahan.
Oh yeah, let's just paint the picture here. This is a headless horseman, of course, but the horse he is riding is also headless and very bloody and gory.
A headless horseman that's riding a headless horse and carrying around a whip of bone.
Oh yeah, his whip is actually made from like a human spine. Very gnarly.
Gnarly indeed, and I'd hate to get struck by that baby. He also carries his head in his other arm.
He does, and it's, according to legend, it is very graphically depicted. It's a head that is a greenish color, his eyes are bulging and darting around like flies, his tongue's lolling out, and the skin is like, it's the consistency of moldy, nasty, rotten cheese.
That's disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting and terrifying all in the same sentence.
Isn't it fantastic, though?
It is, but here's the thing. This is a fairy.
Yes, it is.
He's a terrifying beast, a monster.
He's death's messenger.
I was going to say, he's considered the messenger of death, but he is a fairy.
Yeah, he is, and he's part of... I think a lot of people don't realize that fairies make up an entire group of different monsters that, you know, categorize an entire culture.
Yeah, fairies encompass a vast congregation of monsters. And when we're talking about fairies, we're talking about the fae folk, the fairy folk, and it's literally defined, they're literally defined as the peaceful kind or the peaceful folk.
They're called the kind folk or the peaceful folk, but really they're not always trustworthy, and they're not always kind, and they're certainly not always peaceful. That nickname actually comes from people who were trying to stay in their good graces when they were talking about fairies.
Well, let's give a few examples of the fae folk that people will probably recognize most of these monsters, most of these creatures, but probably not everyone realizes that they're considered fairies.
Well, yeah, let's just start with some common ones that I think everyone should know, and like that's the leprechaun, the banshee.
The leprechaun, you know, being the little dude who's riding the rainbow to the pot of gold, right?
Always has that one shoe that he's working on, never a pair, but just one shoe that he's cobbling away on.
Right, and you mentioned the banshee. Mm-hmm. A lot of people believe that this is a screaming ghost.
Yeah, and she does scream, she does wail, but in truth, she's actually, a lot of people believe that she's like an ancestral spirit that hangs around and tells, hey, one of your people is about to die, you need to make preparations, you need to be prepared for this tragedy. So she's actually kind of one of the good ones.
And that's another point, too, is that there are good and there are evil, there are neutral. There varies on the whole spectrum of the good versus evil line that we talk about. Yeah. Another one would be boggarts or the Leanne and She.
Oh my goodness. Boggarts are some of my favorites. Some people think that I'm a boggart because I stay up late at night and I clean the kitchen at night.
Indeed.
And so boggarts were like these little house spirits that would mend your torn clothing and stuff while everybody else was asleep, and as long as you took care of them.
And that's another thing, that's another point. Boggarts, just in and of themselves, a lot of people see boggarts as these shape-shifting, misty-type creatures that are out in marshes or riverbanks, but boggarts could be right here inside your own home.
And you would never know it. Well, you wouldn't know it until your socks and shiny things starting to
I was going to say, you'd figure it out pretty quick. Goblins are a part of the Fae folk.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and I think one of your favorites is like the drunken version of the Leprechaun. The Clurachaun.
Clurachaun is absolutely one of my favorites, and here's why. Because he protects my whiskey, he protects my wine.
Yes. As long as you take care of him.
I take very good care of my Clurachaun.
I mean, this guy is basically like the boggart of the wine cellar. He keeps it clean, he keeps it nice and cool for the liquor there. He'll also keep it stocked, but just don't piss him off. If you piss him off, he's going to wreck the place.
Well, and if you don't take care of him, even just short of pissing him off, if you don't take care of him, he might take care of your whiskey and wine himself.
He does. And these guys are actually really hard to get rid of, too. There are stories of people who did make a boggart angry or did make a Clurachaun angry, and they couldn't get him out of the house, so they moved. Well, guess what? He followed.
They followed. So the Leprechaun, the Clurachaun, those are common creatures that people know about or should know about, especially the Leprechaun. And as we mentioned before, fairies are not always to be trusted.
I don't think they ever are to be trusted. Even the good ones.
They're tricksy types, to use
Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Rings terminology. They're tricksy.
Tricksy hobbitses.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny though because the fairy folk actually.
Which I'm going to interrupt you right there. When we're talking about the Lord of the Rings lingo there for a minute, J.R.R. Tolkien actually wrote an essay about fairies.
Oh yeah, a lot of his work was inspired by it.
Yeah, and so we actually have a link to that essay, and maybe we'll read some later, I don't know, but we'll at least throw the link up on our site along with this podcast so you can read it, because he's got some interesting thoughts, and you can see a lot from his work in that essay.
Yeah, and like I said, he actually took a lot of inspiration not only from the Germanic, mythologies and folklores, but he actually took a lot from Celtic as well. His elves, they're very high, noble elves, but they are taken from the trooping fairies that are very elegant and very wise and old, and still have that hint of mischief and proud capriciousness about them.
Yeah, so going back to the Leprechaun, you actually have a story that's a kind of a favored story about the Leprechaun that kind of gives us an idea about the fact that they're not to be trusted.
It's funny. We have internet stories today about how you take this step and you complete this ritual and you'll get this devil in the mirror game or this ghost on the stairs. And we have all these little games today that young people like to read on the internet, and some older people too. But back then they had something similar. They had a few different things, but specifically I'm talking about the leprechaun. People actually had a list of rules to follow to catch a leprechaun, and if you did this right, you could catch him and he would take you to his pot of gold. Well, one guy did it, and this is pretty tricky to do. It's like you have to chase him down through this tall field of grass, and he's short, so it's hard to keep track of him, but you can't blink both eyes at the same time. Once you get a hold of him, you can't let go.
That right there, not blinking both eyes at the same time, I think that's borderline impossible.
That's disorienting to say the least, but this guy
especially
did it.
While you're running through a field. I'm just blinking one eye at a time right now, and I would call it winking, but running and doing it, chasing a leprechaun, that's scary.
It's a challenge to be sure, but this one guy did accomplish it, and he got the
according
leprechaun.
to the legend.
Oh yeah,
I've tried to catch the leprechaun.
How did that work out for you?
Not so well.
Was it
the whole blinking thing through the field? Faceplant.
I wasn't there for that one. You'll have to tell me later.
Yeah, you can't follow the rules and catch the leprechaun all the time.
Not all the time, but this guy did. He did it, and he caught the leprechaun. The leprechaun reluctantly took him to his merry pot of gold, if you will, and he gave him some treasure from it. And this guy, all excited, takes the golden coins back to the bar. He goes to pay for a big drink of, whatever he was drinking at the time.
Ale.
Let's say ale.
Probably ale.
Not beer, you think?
Ale.
Okay. But he goes to pay for it with these golden coins, and in his hand, he blinks, and the coins turn to dirt and leaves.
Turn to dust.
And it's funny because fairies actually respected humans that were honest and true to their word, but you couldn't really ever trust them to be the same way.
Strange.
Capricious, I would say.
So that's the story of a leprechaun. You can't always trust the fairy folk. Even though they are peaceful, they're nice, you take care of them, they'll try to take care of you, but they're not trustworthy. There are stories of this type of creature, a fairy, if you will, in so many different cultures around the world. Japanese culture has the story of the Tanuki.
Oh, yeah.
Which is very similar to the leprechaun and has a similar story to the one you just told.
In personality, the two are almost the same because they're both very tricksy. Again, they're kind of pervy and they like to mess with humans. One story of the Tanuki, which is for listeners who don't know, the Tanuki is a raccoon dog. It's an actual animal. You can go look it up. They're very cute and very dangerous still.
But there's a legend surrounding this raccoon dog, this Tanuki.
There's one story of a Tanuki who went and disguised himself as a human and paid for some merchandise with gold coins. And when he walked away, the merchant found that those gold coins turned to, can you take a guess?
Dirt and leaves.
Yeah, just like the leprechaun on the other side of the world.
So we have these ideas. We have the ideas and the stories of elves. We also have stories from Greece.
Yeah, you've got your woodland spirits, your satyrs, your fauns, your sylphs and nymphs that are very similar.
Very similar. Even the gremlins in American folklore.
Yep, World War II, a lot of planes were having mechanical issues, and people thought that they were little gremlins, little spirits in the machine, just kind of messing with the gears.
Yeah, so we have fairies all over the world, different periods of history. We have these legends and these stories that surface, and they're all very interesting. Here's the question, though. What are fairies?
That is the hot question to ask, and it's not an easy one to answer either. I think we should start with what I believe fairies are, what the origin kind of starts out as.
And I think you're going towards nature spirits.
Exactly. They are, they're spirits from nature. They're the woodland folk. They're the spirits inside the trees or inside the hills, if you will. They are the spirits that keep the world turning, the grass growing, the plants lively.
Like a well-oiled machine.
Mm-hmm. They take care of the ecosystem, if you will, I guess.
And we're going to come back to that thought in just a minute, but from these nature spirits throughout time, throughout the stories, both written and oral traditions, we move into the realm of angels and demons, even, that fairies are described as being.
Yeah, it's, so like I said, it's kind of a hard question to answer because from nature spirits, you have all of these legends that surfaced saying that, hey, these were actually a race, a family of old gods. And then once certain religions started to move into the area, they were actually demonized and made to be angels or demons. Some people actually believe that they are the restless undead spirits of that area.
Things like the monsters like the Sluagh.
The Sluagh or the vampiric Deragdu.
We've actually written about the Sluagh in one of our stories, and it's a very popular creature in Ireland. Maybe not popular, but very well known.
Yeah, I mean, a horde of flying fairy zombies. Can you imagine that?
Flying fairy zombies.
And
just those three words together in one sentence is terrifying. So fairies, essentially, by definition, are nature spirits, and in their origin stories, you enter Christianity and religious thought, and because of what fairies do, a lot of people believe them to be angels or demons. We have the stories of them also being the undead, the Sluagh, which are technically sinners who have died and have come back as angry spirits.
Yeah.
And in that same conversation, a lot of people believe that those are demons themselves.
Very true. And then you have, like the vampire we were talking about earlier, you also have those who were victims to heinous crimes who came back as vengeful spirits to, wreak havoc on those they believed worthy of that havoc.
And I want to go back to, because you brought up the topic of vampires. A lot of people would look at you cross-eyed if you said the vampire is a fairy.
Well,
and not all stories of vampires, obviously. That mythology has bloomed into something all to its own, but the origin stories of our modern-day vampire are based on fairies.
Very much. So when Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, he took the legends and the folklore of Eastern Europe, and he actually melded them with the legends of vampiric creatures from his own homeland. So what you get is this Transylvanian count who is very nasty in appearance, but also that same count transforms into this gentlemanly, glamorous vampire who sucks the life out of, young maidens. That's actually a blending of those two cultures, because your Irish fairy is very beautiful, he's very transfixing, he wanders from place to place, and he sucks blood. So our modern Dracula actually somewhat comes from Ireland still.
Comes from that fairy mythology.
Yep, it does.
And it's very interesting. A lot of people would not consider vampires to be fairies, but really they are.
Yeah, and again...
And we go back to the beginning of our conversation where, maybe that's what you were getting ready to say, but...
that is actually exactly what I was going to say.
But they encompass such a vast range, such a broad range of monsters, that so many monsters that we speak of individually today actually belong to the race of the fairy folk.
Yep. And it's kind of saddening because, going to the bookstore and reading, I actually get turned off by books that just pop out and scream, I am a story about fairies, because a lot of them don't really dig deep into it, and they don't really go as deep as they should into that lore.
They just scratch the surface. Let's go back a little bit deeper. We also mentioned earlier about the fairy folk being a race of gods. And let's go back to some original stories and mythology about Ireland itself. Fairies were considered to be the native folk of Ireland, and this stems from the story of this old race of gods who were fairies.
Yeah, we're talking about the Tuatha De Danann. This is a tribe, really, of heroes, kings, witches, knights even, of these amazing people who had almost supernatural abilities. And these people actually fought against a race of giants and disfigured monsters in Ireland. It's almost akin to the story of, the Olympian gods versus the Titans, or the frost giants of Norse mythology versus, the gods. Only in Ireland, these gods didn't succeed. They actually were beaten back, diminished by the race of giants.
They fell. It almost, you add the element of the humans in there, and you start talking Lord of the Rings almost.
Because humans came over to Ireland at that time, and some stuff happened basically, but yeah, the Tuatha De Danann actually fell and were diminished into these smaller beings.
So we have this race of gods, this mighty and beautiful race of creatures that were the native folk of Ireland, went to war with other creatures, lost, which we don't see that a lot in mythology. We don't see that told in a lot of stories, how gods actually fall. But this is a fallen race of gods, and as you mentioned, they became this diminutive folk that really kind of were reduced to strange occurrences and irritating happenstance.
Yeah,
in their activity.
It's like saying that, Zeus or that Thor were beaten back, and then they became a short little person who cobbles one shoe at a time.
So it's very interesting that we have this race of gods that fell, and they became the fairy folk that we have in our stories today. So when you talk about fairies, whether it's Tinkerbell or the Dullahan or the Banshee or goblins or the leprechauns, I think you have to keep at least in the back of your mind, in the back of your thought process, that these are gods from a time before ours.
Very much so, and a lot of the history that was recorded was actually recorded by, or a lot of those stories were recorded by Irish monks at the time. And some of them were modified a little bit, but most of them were pretty true to the old stories. And unfortunately, that's all we have. A lot of the older traditions and oral traditions were lost to us. But if you think about it, you have these gods that it goes back to being nature spirits. They take care of the land and they take care of the earth, but they're fallen and they can only do so much nowadays.
Which is where we also have some of the ideas of them being angels and demons, that demonization of these creatures and their activity through the entrance of Christianity into the influence of that time. We see a lot of Christian thought demonizing the activity or blaming that on what we would consider fairy folk.
Yeah, because I mean, you have your strange occurrences that people were starting to take more notice of, or you had your diseases that would happen against your livestock, or you had mental illnesses.
Yeah, and I think all of this is very important because go back hundreds and hundreds of years, come forward even into our modern age, things like the Gremlins, and you're going to find, the Gremlins of World War II were blamed for aircraft mechanical failure. They were blamed for tools going missing and these type of things. You go back further in history and you have the fairy folk demonized and being blamed for people getting sick, for things being stolen. You have them being blamed for all kinds of things.
Well, it goes back to the old saying, what is a monster? It's something people don't understand and fear, because humans fear what they don't understand. So, what could possibly be causing these illnesses and these disasters? Well, why not, the things that we don't comprehend all the way?
And exactly, why are our crops failing? Why do we have house noises? Why did our wine go bad? Why did our children go missing? Why did our animals get slaughtered? Instead of looking around, and I don't discount supernatural activity by any means, or spiritual influences, but, why do we look around and blame the chickens gone missing on a fairy when you might have coyotes or wolves in the field next to your house?
Well, and that's actually an interesting point because, fairies were oftentimes thought to be shapeshifters and would take animal form. But that's a great point. Why would it be anything other than a normal coyote?
And let's escalate that a little bit, because we move from simple house noises or the wine being spilled or the milk gone bad or crops failing. Let's escalate that a little bit and talk about illnesses, because even in our more modern history, we have fairies being blamed for mental illnesses and disfigurement of babies that are being born. And those are some pretty serious accusations to be thrown on something that we can't really see or touch or understand.
Yeah, it's kind of a difficult... This is kind of wrapped up in the story of the Changeling, and it's kind of a difficult thing to think about. But the Changeling is a fairy child that is ugly and unwanted. So what happens is some fairy will come into a human's house, they'll kidnap the baby, and they'll leave the Changeling behind in its place. And a lot of people today look back and, after studying the stories, believe that those were actually children with autism or other mental or educational issues. And what they've determined is that these children were just misunderstood. And back then, without that understanding, people believed that the children were speaking in adult tongues or strange languages.
Or they were possessed by demons. And
yeah,
unfortunately, the therapies, quote unquote, that came from all of this were torture. I mean, just some crazy medication, even sometimes to the point where they would just kill the children. And sometimes even they would kill adults being diagnosed with this type of thing.
Unfortunately, that is very true, and I think that is the more extreme version, or one of the more extreme examples of people blaming fairies for natural occurrences.
Yeah, but it exists, so you have, if you look back, we have the stories of the fairies, everything from Tinkerbell spreading good cheer with her pixie dust, to the Dullahan being the messenger of death, to gremlins messing with aircraft, to people misdiagnosing children as being demonized by fairies and prescribing torture or even death to take care of these things. So just a wide range of influence in the fairy folk.
Yeah, it's not a simple topic at all, folks. It's quite in-depth, and we unfortunately didn't cover all of it, but at the same time, that's the exciting part, right? We get to revisit it.
Exactly. I think we've opened the door on the fairy folk. There'll be other monsters that we talk about. Specifically, we have a great conversation about the Irish vampire that we want to get into later, and that could take up just a tremendous amount of conversation all to itself. But we've got a lot of great monsters, a lot of really fun monsters, a lot of terrifying monsters that all fit into the family of the fairies.
Well, that being said, is there anything that you would consider not a fairy in our wide world of monsters?
Yes. Great white sharks and Cthulhu.
Oh gosh, back to that again.
I would not consider Cthulhu a fairy.
I probably wouldn't either, but I think he's got his own classification altogether.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Michael, it's been great talking about fairies. I think my coffee is out, and it's closing in on 1 o'clock this morning again, so I'm going to call it a night, and we're going to wrap up here. We'll talk about some more monsters next week.
What do we have for next week?
Well, I'm not sure, but I think we're talking about incubi and succubi.
Yeah, sex demons.
Sex demons, folks.
Right.
Next week, it's sex demons. Until then, you have a good night. Thanks for joining us here on the Monster Guys podcast.